You know, I was reminded of that story, that wonderful story of James Luther Adams and the board of First U in Chicago. A couple of years ago, when my home church, the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Buffalo, was talking about whether or not they would like to hang a Black Lives Matter sign on the front of their building. And there was a lot of discussion and exploration at that time. And it developed that though many people were in favor of it, they were worried about the reaction of the community. They were worried specifically that the congregation, the building, would be vandalized. And many people spoke about the beautiful Indiana limestone that the church was made out of, and their fears for damage to the building. And finally, some of us spoke out and asked what the building was really worth if we did not live our values. That really, what was the meaning of having a beautiful building, historic building, if the church inside was hollow. And eventually, we did decide to hang a Black Lives Matter sign outside in the congregation. Now, you may feel that this was simply a symbolic gesture, and absolutely, symbolic gestures like these don't go far enough. But it was an act of courage on the part of many people to move past their fears of a backlash and to take a position about racial justice. Now, our March theme this month in the congregation is exploration. Exploration means that we're investigating something. We can feel free to look around at it, check things out, without being pushed into taking a position on something before we're really ready. So that's in the spirit of exploration, I invite you to explore with me today the idea of the eighth principle. Now let's ground ourselves in what we've been learning about Unitarian Universalism up to this point in a series that I've shared with you about the nature of covenant and the history of the seven principles. Now, if you need to ground yourself in the seven principles as we have this conversation, we're so lucky here in this beautiful sanctuary, if you're here in the sanctuary with me, because they are all around us. We see them all around us in this beautiful octagonal space. So I would like to share with you these Unitarian Universalist principles so we can refresh our memories. You also have hymnals there on the chairs if you're joining us live. And in the front of the hymnal, you'll also find the seven principles if you'd like to look. So I will just read them as I go around the room. We covenant to affirm and promote, this is our covenant together, the inherent worth and dignity of every person, justice, equity, and compassion in human relations, acceptance of one another, and encouragement to spiritual growth in our congregations, a free and responsible search for truth and meaning, the use of democracy in our congregations and in society at large, along with the right of conscience, the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all. And finally, our newest principle, respect for the interdependent web of existence of which we are a part. So those are the existing seven principles, and let's just remember some things about them. These principles are overlapping, right? So several of them could be said to intersect with one another, like justice, equity, and compassion can't be separated from world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all. The inherent worth and dignity of every person can't really be separated from justice, equity, and compassion, or acceptance for one another. So these things are interrelated and intertwined, as we discussed a couple of weeks ago. Now, none of these principles directly calls Unitarian Universalists to the spiritual work of overcoming oppression. Racism and other oppressions. So let's just keep that in mind as we go forward. Now, this set of principles is from the principles and purposes of the bylaws of the Unitarian Universalist Association, right, which is an association of congregations of which we are a member. So we covenant to be a part of this movement and embrace and affirm these principles through our membership in the UUA. These bylaws are designed because we are part of a living tradition, right? We're part of a living tradition where transformation and change are baked right in. So every 15 years or so, the principles and purposes get reviewed, and we're in the midst of a review right now of a committee that's going to be working on that for about 3 years. And then what happens is the place where the business of the association happens is at General Assembly in the summertime, right? General Assembly held in a different city around the country each year, where delegates from each congregation go to vote on the concerns. So participating in that is a way of living out our fifth principle, right? The democratic process. Now, the language of these principles, as we discussed a few weeks ago, is not really what's sacred. It's the principles themselves. And if you believe, like me, that language is always an imperfect vessel for capturing ideas, then you'll see that there are lots and lots of different ways to express these principles. We express them differently here, presumably because of space, than they are expressed in the hymnal, for example. And we have posters in the religious education classrooms where they are put into language that's more easily understood by kids, for example. So, we talked about General Assembly, and that's the place where these changes get made. Now, where does the eighth principle come into all of this? The eighth principle is both a grassroots movement that's happening at the congregational level, and it's also part of this review process that is happening for the principles and purposes on the national level. So it's kind of working at two different levels. I'll talk to you a little bit about how it got started and then about the grassroots process first. So the eighth principle was born in 2013, actually. So it's almost 10 years old now. Two Unitarian Universalists, Paula Cole-Jones and Bruce Pollock Johnson, a black person and a white person, got together and crafted the eighth principle. And the eighth principle speaks toward dismantling racism and other oppressions, and I will read it in full to you in a little bit. Now, lest you think that this is something coming out of Boston, actually, does anyone know where the first congregation to adopt the eighth principle was and is? It was Philadelphia. Yeah, the first congregation to adopt the eighth principle was the Church of the Restoration in Philadelphia, followed very quickly by the congregation in Honolulu, Hawaii. So those were the first two. And at this point, 156 congregations and groups like the Church of the Larger Fellowship, UU Ministry for Earth, many of the statewide action networks, the Canadian Unitarian Council, have all adopted the eighth principle. And some of the congregations who've adopted it are right around our area. Lancaster, Ginger Hill, Reading, Gettysburg, Pittsburgh, and Media, Pennsylvania congregations have all adopted the eighth principle. Now, and so that's the grassroots process where each congregation votes to adopt. Now, at the same time, the Article 2 Study Commission that's looking at revising the purposes and principles, which happens, like I said, every 15 years or so, is also charged with adding anti-racist and anti-oppression multicultural language to our principles and purposes to be much more explicit. Now let me read you the text of the eighth principle so you can follow along. We, the member congregations of the Unitarian Universalist Association, covenant to affirm and promote journeying towards spiritual wholeness by working to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community, by our actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and in our institutions. Now let's explore that language a little bit, shall we? We, the member congregations of the Unitarian Universalist Association, covenant to affirm and promote. I see it right there. That's just the beginning of the 7 principles, right? That's us covenanting together. Journeying towards spiritual wholeness. What does that mean? Well, this phrase brings with it a variety of thoughts. First, it gives recognition to the Journey Toward Wholeness Transformation Committee, which was a part of the UUA established in 1997 to monitor, advise, and recommend anti-racist initiatives in congregations and in the UUA. Yes, we've been trying to do this work at least since 1997. Unfortunately, monitoring, advising, recommending, despite the fine work of this committee and the individuals on it, has not resulted in substantive changes to our movement or to the culture of our congregations, which continue to struggle, many of them, with being welcoming and inclusive in their cultures and in their membership. Now, Journey Toward Wholeness also reflects the idea that gave this committee its name in the first place. The idea that when we live under historic and systemic oppression, that whether we are of the privileged group or of the oppressed group, we become spiritually stunted, fractured, or flattened. If this work that we are doing for spiritual wholeness is seen as on behalf of someone else over there, we're helping those people over there. Someone in a group of someones that are oppressed, it takes on a flavor of charity, doesn't it? It takes on a kind of nobility. And those of us who are asking for equity and inclusion, those of us from marginalized groups, will be seen as supplicants, people who are pleading for something they need in order to be whole. But in reality, I believe that it is all of us and the entire community that is harmed by inequity and suffering caused by racism and other endemic oppressions. Journeying together towards spiritual wholeness suggests that we are all called, all of us, to this work. The work of repairing the damage and the separation and the suffering that racism and other oppressions have wrought by healing together, reestablishing trust and connection and thriving. Now that damage will be different in each different social location, And so we all have different roles to play in this healing. But I believe it's a given that we are all warped by living in a distorted society that does not recognize the worth and the dignity and the full humanity of every person. And so the path to spiritual wholeness for all of us and all of our children is through repairing and restoring the splintered, unjust, and unequal society. And that's where the next part comes in. Working to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community. Now, what is exactly beloved community? This notion was first established, created by a philosopher named Josiah Royce. Royce's notion of the beloved community was an ideal, one that you could strive toward, you could give it your all, but in this imperfect world, you would never really actually get there. It was a sort of a concept of heaven on earth, a place where everyone would find greater meaning than their individual lives and concerns could offer. In fact, he insisted that a person couldn't be fully human except within a community that they could give their loyalty to. Now, in this, he was at odds with some notable Unitarian figures like Walt Whitman and Ralph Waldo Emerson, whose philosophies of individualism tied a human's highest purpose to the individual's search for truth and meaning. But by way of a side note, I would like you to note that there is nothing about an individual search in the fourth principle. It is a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. It can be a community search. Now, the idea of a diverse, multicultural beloved community was something put forth by the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. He adapted Royce's vision to a new era in the 20th century. Now, for King, beloved community was a very real, attainable goal. It was that place he mentioned where people would be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. A place where love and welcome and belonging and equity was available to everyone. Now, interestingly, as Paula Cole-Jones, one of the creators of this principle, has noted, even though Unitarian Universalists consistently mention love as one of their cardinal values and choose it as a guiding force in their lives, nowhere in these principles is the word love mentioned. I'm so glad we do have the word love in our bond of union because it's a very special part. It's sort of the culmination, I think, of our bond of union. But the 7 principles contain no reference to love. And so with beloved community, we center the idea of love and connection and belonging here in this 8th principle. Moving on to the next part of the principle. By our actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions. By our actions. Now, many people have commented that the principle is not like the rather lovely classical language of the other principles, right? And that's true. That is absolutely true. For one thing, there is a mention of we, right? Or at least the possessive version, our actions that accountably dismantle in our institutions and in ourselves. So there's a mention of people there. In a lot of these other ones, there's just sort of these disembodied principles. Now, for another one, this principle calls us to take actions and have accountability. Now, I personally would say that rather than kind of watering down this principle to sound like all the others, maybe we need to change all the others to make them more active and more accountable, right? Because after all, if we just enjoy repeating them or reading them or seeing them on the wall, but do not make any effort to live into them, then they are worthless, aren't they? They are as worthless as Indiana limestone, with no values behind them. So, by our actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions, what does accountability mean here? It means that all of us make a commitment to justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, or JEDI, as we like to say, for the Star Wars fans out there. A public commitment with the adoption of the eighth principle in some ways is merely a symbolic step, but the language requires us to back it up with action and accountability. So we take steps to live it out. And this is one of the most crucial and also one of the most challenging parts of the language. Now, why is racism mentioned separate from other categories of oppression? As Paula Cole-Jones says, it's because while Unitarian Universalists have made great strides in many sectors, like the inclusion of women in the ministry, here I am, the welcoming of LGBTQ plus folks, and to a lesser extent, welcoming disabled people and including them in our congregational life, we have not made progress toward changing our culture from one that centers European or white practices, music, traditions, and social norms. And when the past century of our history is surveyed, we see that despite the strong participation of UUs in the civil rights movement, yes, absolutely, we can be proud of that. We've still been rocked by racial conflicts within our own movement, time and time again. This includes the Black empowerment controversy of the late 60s, in which Black UUs walked out after many whites were threatened by the idea of a Black UU caucus within our larger movement, as well as the hiring controversies of 2016, when a pattern of hiring white males over highly qualified applicants of color was identified within the UUA, prompting the resignation of the former president, Peter Morales. Now, each of these events could be a sermon in itself, and maybe it will be someday. I wish I could go into more depth here, but time demands that I suffice to say now that our movement has been caught up in racial conflict numerous times, resulting in UUs of color not feeling included and in leaving our movement in anger and frustration. Nevertheless, every other type of oppression is explicitly included in the principle as well, and UUs are called to dismantle each of them by this language. Now, please remember that ours is a living tradition. As I mentioned before, the principles and the purposes are reimagined every 15 years or so. So rest assured, if the eighth principle were to get adopted in droves by our congregations and incorporated into the principles and purposes as is, and if somehow it's so wildly successful that it solves racism in Unitarian Universalist congregations and communities, then we can always take out that particular emphasis in the future versions. Now let's move on to another part of the phrase, in ourselves and our institutions. This is the end of the eighth principle, in ourselves and our institutions. Now, as I've noted, UUs are very good at working for justice for those people over there, right? Maybe, just maybe that's why we had such high participation in the civil rights movement, because Northerners were all too happy to head down to the South to tell those folks why they needed to integrate, right? But when it comes to a process that I think takes even more courage and resolve, a process of looking within and dismantling oppression in our own minds and hearts, in our own institutions, in our own communities, our record is far more spotty. So this principle calls us to work on ourselves first. recognizing that true transformation comes through reflection, exploration, understanding, and then sustained and accountable, purposeful action towards change. Now, there is so much that I would like to say, so much more I would like to share about the eighth principle. But for today, we'll wrap up today's exploration. I'm going to continue to speak about Unitarian Universalist movements toward anti-racism and anti-oppression and multiculturalism as we go along. Because as your minister, I am called to share with you the ideas and the movements that are alive and percolating in Unitarian Universalism today. I've shared this time of exploring the eighth principle with you because as a person and a religious professional, I am absolutely committed to this principle. I absolutely believe that all of us here are called to the spiritual work of dismantling racism and other oppressions. I believe that we must take committed and purposeful action on this to truly call ourselves UUs. But as a congregation, in a movement with congregational polity, it is you who have the power to decide yes or no about this. My job is to bring it to you and to help us explore it together. Like that board of trustees way back in Chicago, way back in the 1950s and 60s, I hope we'll take time to address all of the fears and the doubts and the concerns and the objections. And in the end, I hope that we'll decide, like that board member so long ago, that the purpose of church is to get a hold of people like us, all of us, every single one of us, and transform our lives into something greater as we journey towards spiritual wholeness, every single one of us on the road together. I hope that we'll agree that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And I hope that we'll commit to the work of justice everywhere, even and maybe especially in our congregations. May it be so. Amen.
There is more love somewhere. There is more love somewhere. I'm gonna keep on till I find it. There is more love somewhere.